Hello, good morning. As the scary danger music plays. How are you? Hi, Trey. Thank you so much for the host. Hope you're doing well. I appreciate that. Um, we are doing a read stream, which we haven't done in a while. But I decided it was about time that we jumped into another book. Hi, Celeste. How are you? The next book that I will be reading is going to be The Bluebeard Room, which is Nancy Drew book number 77. And one exciting thing about this is that it is the book that Curse of Blackmore Manor is based off of. So, I don't really want to dilly-dally too much, but I think we might just go ahead and jump in here. So, without further ado. The Bluebeard Room by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 1. A Strange Chat. Guess who's at the party, Nancy? About half the population of Long Island, I should think. Grinning, Nancy Drew gazed around at the guests. Some were dancing under a striped pavilion, while others chatted or sauntered about the lawn. Their talk and laughter, mingled with the strains of music, made it difficult to be heard. No, be serious, Nan. Guess who? I am serious, Bess. I've met about a dozen people just in the last few minutes, and I doubt that I'll remember any of their names when we leave. You'll remember this person's name, Bess Marvin declared firmly. All right, I give up. The strawberry blonde sapphire eyes twinkled. Who's here? Lance Warwick. The rock star? Nancy's eyes opened wide. How many Lance Warwicks are there? Bess was thrilled. Wow, if you're right, we may be in for a mob scene. The teenage detective was something of a celebrity herself, yet she couldn't help feeling a tingle of excitement at the chance of meeting the popular British rock star in person. Lance Warwick had that effect on most girls. His group, the Crowned Heads, was just winding up a sensational concert tour of the United States. Have you actually seen him, Bess? Not yet, but somebody said he just went by the pavilion, so George is trying to spot him. Georgia Fane, nicknamed George, was Bess's cousin. Aren't you glad we came now? Nancy teased. Remember how George kept saying this party would be a terrible bore? I know. Oh, Nancy, if we'd missed such a chance, I never would have forgiven myself. Nancy giggled at her plump blonde friend's quivering enthusiasm. While visiting Nancy's Aunt Eloise in New York City, the three girls had been invited to a charity garden party given by a women's university club to which her aunt belonged. The party was being held in a white columned mansion overlooking the blue waters of Long Island Sound, and so far the girls had enjoyed every minute of it. Lance Warwick would be a terrific added attraction. Is his whole group here, or just the king himself? Nancy inquired. I don't know, but wouldn't it be thrilling if we could meet all the crowned heads? Bess gushed. Wait, here comes George now. Georgia Fane could hardly have been more different from her cousin. A pretty trim-figured girl with short dark hair, she was as active and adventurous as her boyish nickname suggested. Well, did you see Lance Warwick? Nancy asked with a grin. He's back at the pavilion again, dancing with one of the club women, said George, but you should see all these idiot Debs waiting to cut in. Bess dimpled. You wouldn't stoop to such tactics yourself, I presume? Only if I could find some way to cut them all out. By the way, Nancy, here's something for you. George handed her a folded note. What's this? Don't ask me. Remember that servant in the white jacket who recognized you when we arrived? The one who held the car door open for us? George nodded. He said a friend was looking for you and asked me to give you this. Since the girls were strangers on the island, and her Aunt Eloise had another engagement which had prevented her from attending the party, Nancy could not imagine who the friend might be. The note was on monogrammed cream vellum, evidently torn from a purse pad. Nancy, can we talk for a few moments? I'll be waiting by the refreshment table nearest the garden. Olive Harwood. Harwood. Nancy gave a little exclamation of surprise. It's from Mrs. Harwood. Do you remember her? Of course, said Bess. She used to be a neighbor of ours back in River Heights. Moved to New York, didn't she? George added, after her daughter married that Englishman. That's right. She wants to talk to me about something. Keep an eye on developments with Lance Warwick, you two. I'll be right back. Nancy started off across the lawn, weaving her way among the party guests. Presently, she caught sight of her former neighbor. The straw-hatted society matron looked rather grave and thoughtful, but broke into a smile of greeting as the teenager approached. "Nancy, dear!" "Why, Mrs. Harwood, how nice to see you again. How does Lisa like married life in England?" "I wish I could say she was ecstatically happy, Nancy, but the truth is I'm worried about her. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Shortly before the widowed Mrs. Harwood had moved to New York, her only child, Lisa, had married an English aristocrat named Hugh Penvillin. Their wedding had been one of River Heights' most festive and fashionable in recent years. It was obvious to everyone that the couple were deeply in love, and the fact that after their honeymoon they would be settling in the groom's ancestral castle gave the whole affair an aura of fairy tale romance. But now it sounded as though the two might not be living happily ever after. "Is anything wrong?" Nancy's keen eyes searched the other's face sympathetically. "I'm very much afraid so," Mrs. Harwood sighed. "Yet I seem to be groping in the dark. That's what's so frustrating, Nancy. I can't imagine what could possibly have come between Lisa and Hugh." "Have you seen them since the wedding?" "Yes, I flew to London at Christmas time. That's when I first realized something was troubling Lisa." "She's still in love with Hugh, surely?" "Oh, more than ever. In fact, when I suggested she come back to New York with me for a week or so, Lisa wouldn't hear of it. It seemed she couldn't bear to be parted from him, even for that long." Nancy was puzzled. "Then what makes you think anything's amiss?" "The way she looks and acts. Everything about her. You know how gay and lively Lisa always was? Well, now she seems totally changed. Her eyes are absolutely haunted, Nancy. She acts as though some terrible secret is weighing on her mind, dragging down her spirits. She looks dreadful." Nancy suggested they sit on a garden bench and brought 2 glasses of punch from the refreshment table. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harwood opened her handbag and took out an airmail envelope with a British stamp. In it was a colored snapshot, which she handed to Nancy as Nancy handed her one of the glasses of punch. The teenager studied the photo with interest. It showed Lisa in the foreground, her blonde hair streaming in the breeze. Penvillin Castle loomed behind her on a grassy headland, with the vivid blue sea sparkling below in the summer sunshine. "What a beautiful place to live," Nancy said. "The castle's in Cornwall, isn't it?" "Yes, it's in the southwest of England, but it's Lisa herself I wanted you to see. Can't you tell just by looking at her that she's unhappy?" The attractive blonde girl whom Nancy had known all through their school years had certainly changed, and judging by the photo, not for the better. She seemed thinner, almost haggard, and her slanting green eyes had dark circles. "Lisa does not look herself, that's for sure," Nancy agreed. "Perhaps she's homesick." "Then why won't she come back, if only for a short visit?" Mrs. Harwood shook her head, her eyes clouded with concern. "No, I'm convinced it's far more serious than that." "Do you and Lisa keep in close touch?" "Oh, yes, we correspond frequently and talk on the phone every few days." Olive Harwood seemed to want to say something else. At last she blurted, "Nancy, will you treat what I'm about to say in absolute confidence?" "Of course, Mrs. Harwood. You wouldn't be confiding in me if you didn't know that already. What is it?" "Am I being foolish to wonder if Hugh may secretly be poisoning my daughter?" End of chapter 1. Let me catch up on the thing. I'm confused onto what these books are. Nancy Drew. Oh yeah, these are detective mysteries. Plump blonde friend hound. I know, they kind of describe Bess in like a negative way. Hi Tara, good morning, by the way. I hope you're enjoying the Harry Potter books. Oh, I've been busy too, Celeste, I understand. "3 weeks off school. Oh. Treat it as a positive." Yeah, Trey, you can do it. We believe in you. If you're enjoying this story, then that's all that counts. Thank you for the host, Terror. I appreciate it. I'm so thirsty. By the way, I plan to read 6 chapters today, so that was just chapter 1. Okay, go have fun going book shopping. Have a nice week for yourself as well. I hope you have a good rest of the Saturday, too. I get today off, which is super exciting. They describe Bess like a turkey. I know. It's kind of mean. I got called off of school, but they still send me to work. Yeah, I still have to go to work, too. You know. Okay, let's move along. So, Terror, as you can see, you'll have lots of comparisons to make between this book and the game. Okay. Chapter 2, The Stone Arrowhead. For a moment, Nancy was too shocked to reply. The sedate society matron looked deadly serious. What on earth makes you think he might want to kill Lisa? Nancy asked incredulously. It's not as fantastic as it may sound, Mrs. Harwood persisted. Many of these titled Englishmen, from what I hear, haven't enough money to keep up their huge estates. And Lisa's a rich girl in her own right. Her grandfather left a fortune to her, which came under Lisa's full control when she turned 21, so now if anything happened to her, that money would all go to her husband. Has Lisa seen a doctor recently? She says she has, and tells me he found nothing wrong, but I'm terribly afraid she may be covering up, for Hugh's sake. Nancy scarcely knew how to respond. You met him during their engagement, Mrs. Harwood. Were you suspicious of Hugh then? Surely he didn't strike you as a potential murderer. No, I must admit he hadn't, but that was before I saw this dreadful change in Lisa. Nancy shook her head doubtfully. I'm afraid I find that idea awfully hard to accept. But what other explanation is there? I don't know, but there may be some perfectly simple reason. Find it, then. Nancy's blue eyes widened in surprise. What exactly are you saying, Mrs. Harwood? The older woman laid a hand on Nancy's arm. My dear, the two of you have been friends for years, and Lisa thinks the world of you. She always spoke as if there was no situation...
Your entertainment while we are in quarantine.
She always spoke as if there was no situation you couldn't handle. No mystery that Nancy Drew couldn't solve. Won't you please look into this one, if only to put my mind at ease? Nancy was touched. I'm happy Lisa feels that way, Mrs. Harwood, and flattered that you should ask me to help, but really, Lisa's in England, and I'll soon be going home to River Heights. How can I possibly find out what's wrong? That's no problem, my dear. You could fly to England for a week or 2 at my expense. When Lisa hears you're coming, she's sure to invite you to visit her in Cornwall. That way, you can see for yourself how she and Hugh are getting along and decide if there are any grounds for my suspicions. Nancy had no immediate plans for the summer, and the idea of a trip to England was certainly tempting. She loved London, and right now it was an exciting source of trendy new fashions, new music, and new lifestyles. All the same, she felt deep misgivings about prying into Lisa's marriage. Her knack for solving mysteries had made the name of Nancy Drew well known to the public, and had brought the teenage sleuth intriguing cases from points far beyond River Heights. But none of her cases had ever involved her in problems between a husband and wife. Do say you will, my dear, pleaded the older woman as she picked up the envelope to replace her daughter's photograph in it. I don't know what to tell you, Mrs. Harwood, but to be honest, I feel... Nancy broke off as she saw something fall into her friend's lap. Where on earth did that come from? She inquired softly. It looked like a tiny arrowhead, about an inch long, carved from some sort of glassy stone. Olive Harwood, I cannot say that name, picked it up between her thumb and forefinger. It was in the envelope when I first opened it, she replied. I wondered myself, but there wasn't a word about it in Lisa's letter, so I suppose it must have gotten into the envelope by accident. Odd little thingamajig. She went on as Nancy studied the object with a troubled frown. Looks rather Stone Age, doesn't it? Like one of those ancient artifacts archaeologists dig up. Nancy nodded absently, absorbed in her thoughts. She had once read about an English farmer plowing up a gold ornament dating back to the days of King Alfred. With a sigh, her former neighbor returned to the subject that was uppermost in her mind. Anyhow, my dear, please say you will visit Lisa. Let me think about it, and I'll give you a definite answer tomorrow. And may I keep this thingamajig for the time being? Mrs. Harwood smiled and patted her hand. Of course, Nancy. And now let me ask something else. Would you like to meet Lance Warwick? The pretty teenager flashed a smile. What girl wouldn't? Can you arrange that? I can do better than that. I'll introduce you personally. Taking Nancy by the hand, she rose and drew her back toward the party. You're serious? Nancy asked as they left their glasses at the table and started across the lawn. Absolutely. I'm one of the people who persuaded him to come here today. I thought it might help ticket sales. He's promised to preside over the raffle, you see. You know Lance Warwick? Nancy asked in surprise. My son-in-law does. I suppose you could call that one of the fringe benefits that go with a titled English connection. Many of the guests were now clustering around the pavilion. Evidently, word had spread that the British rock star was among the dancing couples. Although 2 other members of his group were also on hand, he was the focus of all eyes. The music of the garden party orchestra was tame and conventional compared to the rock groups, yet Lance seemed to fit in and dominate the scene naturally. In his white silk suit with his lavender shirt and tie and spiky blonde hair, he was instantly recognizable, an impish mixture of Mick Jagger, Billy Idol, and David Bowie. At the same time, Lance Warwick was, as always, uniquely himself and outrageously handsome. Nancy was suddenly annoyed at herself for thinking so. Her attitude toward the rock star had abruptly changed. He was acting too much like the lord of the manor, she felt, dancing with one girl after another while all the rest stood oohing and awing around the fringes, eagerly hoping to catch Lance's eye. George was right, thought Nancy. They are idiots. Do I really want to become one of them? Lance had just noticed Mrs. Harwood and was blowing her a kiss. She waved her fingers gently and put an arm around Nancy to draw his attention to the Titian-haired teen. Lance winked at her and smiled back at the older woman. Be right with you, Olive, darling. Nancy blushed as a dozen girls looked daggers at her. She could imagine their envious thoughts, wondering why she should be favored with the Rock King's attention ahead of them. Lance swung his current partner carelessly away into the waiting arms of his drummer, Bobo Evans. Then he started jauntily toward Mrs. Harwood and her attractive young companion. Nancy abruptly turned away from the pavilion. Mrs. Harwood called out, Nancy, dear, where are you going? Lance wants to dance with you. No, thanks. Tell him I appreciate the honor, but I'd rather have another glass of punch. End of chapter 2. What the heck? Don't give me homework with Olive Harwood. It's Harwood, and I keep saying Hardwood. I keep messing that up. Thank you for the claps and hype. Thank you for the resub, Moocher. Nancy feeling guilt about prying into private matters? Psh, lies. Okay, have fun, Trey, reading. Is Bobo Evans just a monkey in his band? I swear. It seems so strange. Oh, you're aware it's Harwood? Okay. I just keep messing it up. Thank you for the claps. Yeah, it's this Lance fella. Seems like a something. That description of the rock star, right? He seems like a real treat. Sounds like a Frankenstein of other rock stars. That's funny. Okay. Chapter 3. Witch Lore. Eloise Drew lived in a charming old Victorian apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. With its turrets and gargoyles and crenellated ramparts, it looked like something out of a gothic horror movie, but Nancy loved its spacious, high-ceilinged rooms and romantic atmosphere. Well, I hear you put the King of Rock in his place yesterday, her aunt joked as Nancy emerged from the guest room next morning. Bess and George had already beaten her to the breakfast table. Something tells me a couple of gossipy little tongues have been wagging, said Nancy, grinning at her 2 chums. No, actually, it was Olive Harwood who told me. Oh my, I hope I didn't embarrass her. Nancy looked contrite as she took a chair. Not to worry, my dear, she thought you showed a splendidly independent spirit. She did. You should have seen her, Miss Drew, put in George Fane. Here were all these swooning females ready to fling themselves at Lance Warwick's feet, and Nancy gives him the brush off. But what a waste! Bess lamented. The chance of a lifetime, and she passes it up. And was he ever surprised? George chuckled. The poor guy was stunned. He couldn't believe that any girl would actually decline the thrill of dancing in his glamorous embrace. Nancy winced. I was a bit rude. Baloney. It did him good. He was really getting too arrogant for words, the way he was carrying on there in the dance pavilion. He'd have to be pretty unusual not to have his head turned by all that attention. Nancy helped herself to a slice of toast. I must say he seemed nice enough when we talked later on. In fact, Nancy felt ashamed of her display of temper. Lance had come upon her later in the evening in their host's mansion and had insisted on escorting her through the food line. Not only had he proven himself a charming conversationalist, he'd refrained from even mentioning the abrupt way Nancy had turned her back on him in the pavilion. Aunt Eloise smiled and poured herself more coffee. Well, at any rate, he sounds like a very interesting young man. By the way, Nancy, Olive Harwood asked me to remind you to call her about what you discussed yesterday. Oh, yes, I'm glad you did, Aunt Eloise. Nancy suddenly turned serious. Which reminds me of something else. What's the name of the bookstore in Greenwich Village? Which bookstore, dear? The occult one where you got me that book about the lore of the Mandrake Root? Anyway, when I was trying to find more information, the proprietor went to all sorts of trouble to help me. Nigel Murgatroyd, you mean, and his shop's called Merlin's Den. He's an elderly Englishman, worked as an archaeologist, I understand. A really interesting fellow, but why do you ask, dear? I'd like to go see him today and look around his shop. Nancy ended vaguely. Don't tell us you're on to another mystery case. The teen sleuth smiled and shrugged off George's question. Not exactly, or not yet, anyhow. But I thought we were going shopping, Bess protested. You two go ahead, and I'll join you for lunch at Bloomy's at noon. We still have the whole afternoon. The three girls caught a southbound Broadway 7th Avenue subway train. Bess and George got off at 50th Street within walking distance of Rockefeller Center and the glamorous 5th Avenue window shopping below. Nancy rode on downtown to the village. Merlin's Den was a dark hole-in-the-wall shop with little hint outside of the mysterious treasures within. Unlike some of Manhattan's trendier occult bookstores, this one offered no tarot cards, Ouija boards, or herbal displays, but its shelves were stocked with a vast array of arcane volumes, many of them rare and long out of print. An immensely fat man with a gray mustache and goatee came forward. May I help you, miss? His lively amber eyes narrowed in a frown of puzzled interest. I say, have we met before? Nancy's own sapphire blue eyes twinkled back at him. No, but we've spoken on the phone. I'm Nancy Drew. Ah! Hello, Miss Drew. How wonderful finally to meet you. As he squeezed her hand warmly, she went on. I happen to be in New York and need some more information, so I thought I'd stop in and avail myself again to your vast knowledge of the occult. Nancy's formal little speech seemed to strike just the right note. How charming, how delightful, the fat bookman beamed. I can't imagine anything that would delight me more on this lovely summer's day. He insisted on drawing her back into the dim, cool recesses of his crowded store toward a corner containing his littered roll-top desk, office chair, and an ancient, chintz-covered rocker. He sat Nancy down on the rocker, made some tea, then said, Now tell me your problem. The Titian-hair teenager opened her shoulder bag and fished out the tiny arrowhead that had fallen from Mrs. Harwood's airmail letter. The effect on Nigel Murgatroyd was striking. His eyes widened and he caught his breath sharply. He picked up the small object from Nancy's open palm, grasping it gingerly between his thumb and forefinger as if it were some live, poisonous specimen. Do you know what this is? He asked. I think so. It was sent to a friend of mine. From England? But yes, of course, it must have been. Well, my dear, as you've doubtless guessed, this is what's called an elf dart, or elf bolt. A peculiarly British witch weapon. Meant to do harm? Psychological harm? Oh, definitely, but not just psychological. These deadly little toys have been known to kill. Are you serious? Murgatroyd shrugged. If one believes in them, at any rate. Even if one doesn't, they often lead to dire results, it would seem. For instance, Mary, Queen of Scots' foreign lover Rizzio, and her second husband, Lord Darnley, were both targets of elf darts shortly before they were murdered. Nancy shivered in spite of her common sense. The bookshop owner went on. Any way you look at it, my dear, this little stone arrowhead is a nasty bit of work. You may take it from me. Someone wishes your friend evil. Nancy was silent a moment as she returned it to her handbag. And who might have sent my friend such a thing? A modern witch? He nodded, frowning. That's the likeliest answer. In olden times, it was the fairy folk, the little people who supposedly zinged them at anyone they didn't like. The victim was said to be elf-shot, but later on it was usually witches who were accused of using elf bolts. You'll find them mentioned again and again in accounts of the witch trials. What can you tell me about witches, Mr. Murgatroyd? Well, even today, historians and anthropologists aren't quite sure what to make of witchcraft. Some say it's what's left of the old religion that the early peoples of Europe believed in before they were converted to Christianity. Wicca is what the witches themselves call their craft. They believe they're making use of the forces of nature to help or harm people. The good ones practice white magic. Elf darts, needless to say, are examples of black magic. You believe witchcraft still exists? Nancy asked. No doubt about that, my dear. I've personally witnessed witchcraft rites. And in the British Isles, I can assure you there are witch covens that have existed secretly for hundreds of years, even during times when belonging to one might result in being burned at the stake. The fat man rose and fetched a book from one of the shelves. Here, read this. It should answer any questions you may have on the subject. Nancy glanced at the book's spine curiously and turned to the title page. Wicca, the Way of Wisdom. It had been printed at Oxford in 1907. How much do I owe you for this? Nigel Murgatroyd looked hurt. He raised a pudgy hand. My dear Miss Drew, how can you ask? It's my very great pleasure to assist America's most attractive young mystery solver. Bess and George were both flushed with excitement when Nancy joined them for lunch at Bloomingdale's. Oh my gosh, Nan, you should see the goodies they have on display here, Bess exclaimed. Out of this world, George confirmed. I can easily imagine shoppers having a mental breakdown deciding what to buy. In that case, Nancy laughed, save your money and avoid the risk. By the time the trio returned to Aunt Eloise's apartment, all three were laden with parcels. Nancy giggled as her aunt cocked an amused eyebrow at their purchases. Ball them out for extravagance, Aunt Ellie. I have an excuse. Indeed. You must tell me about it, but later, please, after I've fortified myself with a sip of the homemade blackberry cordial that Hannah has sent me. Hannah Gruen was the Drews' housekeeper, who had cared for Nancy devotedly ever since the untimely death of Mrs. Drew when Nancy was only 3. In the meantime, Eloise Drew said as she picked up a plain brown envelope, here's something that came for you this afternoon. Oh, thank you, said Nancy. What's in it? Haven't the vaguest idea. It came by messenger. Nancy was puzzled as she saw the writing on the envelope. One address had been crossed out and another substituted. How odd. This was first sent to that house on Long Island where the party was held, and then redirected here, Aunt Eloise. Yes, so I noticed. There was, however, no return address. Nancy opened the envelope and plucked out the contents. Well, come on, don't keep us in suspense, begged Bess, intrigued by the astonished look on her friend's face. What is it? 3 tickets to the Crowned Heads farewell concert at Madison Square Garden. Abrupt ending to chapter 3. Miss Lee Fatman, dang, Nancy Drew, surprised you didn't mistakenly think that was Bess. Oh, man. Elf darts. Next, we'll talk of hair growth formula giving somebody hairy arms and palms. Elf darts. So it seems like this book is dipping a little bit deeper into, like, witchcraft than the book does. Thank you for the claps. We've read 3 chapters, and I want to read 3 more. So, oh my gosh, they have tickets to see the Crowned Heads at Madison Square Garden. It sounds so great and fun. Or something. Oh boy. They get to see Mick Jagger riddle the other guy. Yeah, exactly. They said Mick Jagger, David Bowie, and I don't remember what the third one was. I'm gonna look. Billy Idol. Yeah. Yeah. Nice day for a white wedding. Okay, anyway, we're gonna move on. After I read 6 chapters today, I'm gonna take a quick break and go offline and switch over and maybe play some Pokemans. I'm just into it for Bobo Evans. The drum playing monkey. My nose is kind of runny. Okay. Chapter 4. Rock Idol. The Crowned Heads concert? Bess's plump cheeks were suddenly pink with fresh excitement. Nancy nodded, trying not to betray the fact that her own pulse had quickened. Don't ask me how good the seats are, though. I'm not too sure what these letters and numbers stand for. May I see? Asked George, who knew the garden seating plan from a previous rock concert. Hey, these are front row center. She stared breathlessly at her Tahitian-haired chum. Nancy, dear, do I get a teeny-weeny impression that 3 seats mean Bess and I are included in this invitation? Certainly looks that way, unless Aunt Ella... Miss Drew thrust out her hands in protest. Don't look at me, you all. My darling niece knows very well I'm no rock fan. Wow, cried Bess. Do you realize Crowned Heads tickets for seats nowhere near as good are being scalped for $100 a piece? I heard it on the TV news. May I ask where these tickets come from? Aunt Eloise inquired, if I'm not being too naive. 3 guesses, laughed Bess, causing Nancy to dimple and blush slightly. Her aunt smiled. Well, you must have made quite an impression on young Mr. Warwick. I wouldn't know about that, but I do know one thing, said Nancy, eager to change the subject. Oh yeah, like what? Asked George. The concert's tonight, which means we have half an hour to eat dinner, shower, and get dressed. Frantic activity followed, with the 3 girls squirming past each other as they ran back and forth between guest room and bathroom. How on earth do you youngsters do it? Miss Drew wondered aloud. If I'd just come back from a day's shopping, I'd be ready for an early bedtime or several hours snoozing in an armchair. I think Bess must be snoozing in the tub, complained George. She rapped sharply on the bathroom door. For heaven's sake, Bess, please hurry up. You've been soaking for ages. Look who's talking, Bess's voice echoed off the tiled walls. At least I don't spend hours admiring myself in the bathroom mirror. Naturally, George retorted, since you have so little to admire. Nancy giggled, knowing their insults were all in fun. Later, Nancy had just finished putting on her earrings and touching up her lip gloss when she remembered about Mrs. Harwood. Oh dear, I have to call Mrs. Harwood before we go. Bess glanced fretfully at her watch. Must you, Nancy? We haven't much time if we want to be on time for the concert. It'll be too late to phone by the time we get back. Don't worry, I will make it brief, only I must call Dad, too. Why? Asked George. To let him know I may be going to England. There were gasps of surprise. And that's another reason why you two should try to get along, Nancy added with a teasing grin. You may have only each other's company on the plane home tomorrow. Turning to her aunt, the teenager asked, Okay if I use the phone, Aunt Eloise? Of course, my dear. So this was your excuse for all the clothes shopping this afternoon? You guessed it, Nancy twinkled. The Drews' housekeeper answered Nancy's call to River Heights. Oh, Nancy, how good to hear from you. Are you having fun in New York? Loads, Hannah. And I found one of those walks in the size you wanted in Chinatown. It's being shipped out right from the store. After a further fond exchange between the two, Nancy's father, the distinguished attorney Carson Drew, came on the line. How's the law seminar, Dad? Nancy asked. Stuffy, but I dare say we all learned a few things. What's going on in Manhattan? A rock concert tonight, as a matter of fact, so I have to make this quick. You may not be seeing me at dinner tomorrow, Daddy. Nancy told him about Mrs. Harwood's unusual request. I wasn't keen on going at first, but now I think I will. By all means do, honey. It should be a real summer treat. I know how much you like London, and Cornwall's the loveliest corner in England. What bothers me is not telling Lisa my real reason for coming. I hate the thought of snooping on her and her husband. If she herself invites you to Cornwall for a visit, I think your conscience can be clear. I hope so. Daddy, you've known Mrs. Harwood for years. What's your opinion of her? Very level-headed, or so she always seemed to me. Takes after her father, old Sam Austin. He was a banker here in River Heights, you know. As a matter of fact, I helped draw up the terms of the trust fund when he left most of his fortune to Lisa. Really? Mrs. Harwood says if anything happened to Lisa, all her money would go to Hugh Penvillin. Is that right? Yes, I assume so, now that she's 21. Unless... Mr. Drew's voice trailed off. Are you there, Dad? Yes, I was just racking my memory. It seems to me there might be some special clause in the terms of the trust that could prevent that, but I'm hanged if I can remember what it was at the moment. Never mind, you can let me know later, Daddy. Thanks for the information. We're in kind of a hurry, so I better sign off now. Lots of love! Next, Nancy called Olive Harwood and told her she was prepared to go to England. Oh, Nancy, I'm so glad to hear that. How soon? Whenever you like. Tomorrow, even if it's possible to get a flight on such short notice. I'm sure it is. My travel agent's marvelous, Mrs. Harwood replied. She seems to have a sixth sense for ferreting out cancellations. Great, I'll be standing by. I'll have her book you a room at Claridge's in London, so Lisa will know where to reach you. Incidentally, I called her yesterday right after we talked. I wanted to let her know as soon as possible that you might be coming. How'd she react? She was delighted. She's just dying to see someone from back home, especially an old friend like you. She thinks so much of you, Nancy. Well, I feel the same way about Lisa, so I'll look forward to seeing her again, Mrs. Harwood. Nancy hung up, excited by the thought of her upcoming trip abroad and hoping she'd made the right decision. George and Bess were waiting to whisk her out the door. The girls had no trouble flagging a cab and were soon whizzing down Broadway. At Times Square, in the glittering heart of the theater district, the taxi turned onto 7th Avenue. Traffic was already very heavy. By the time their driver turned right toward the round, glowing, modernistic bulk of Madison Square Garden, everything had slowed to a crawl. Good grief, is it always like this on a concert night? Bess gulped as they got out and paid the driver. You ain't seen nothing yet, miss, he said. Wait till you try to get in. The streets were flooded with a surging, boisterous sea of humanity. Policemen struggled to keep order while vendors hawked their wares from the curb or mingled with the crowd, peddling t-shirts, programs, posters, photos, lapel pins, dolls, and a variety of other souvenirs. Amazingly, everyone was in good humor. Even back in placid River Heights, Nancy would have expected an occasional outburst of temper from an overflowed crowd. But here the rock fans seemed as patient and cheerful as if they were all old friends. Patience was certainly needed. The lines inched their way into the auditorium as attendants stationed at half a dozen points checked tickets. For the first time since receiving the complimentary tickets, Nancy had time to think about what they implied. The eager, keyed-up fans all around her showed how much excitement Lance Warwick and his group generated. The Rock King was besieged by girls whenever he appeared in public. Was it really possible that she had attracted the star's interest just by their brief encounter at the garden party? The thought was certainly flattering. An Australian backup group, the Didgeridoo, performed first to warm up the audience. Not that any warm-up was needed. When the curtains finally rose on the crowned heads amid a blaze of psychedelic strobe lights, the whole auditorium seemed to explode. The storm of applause sank to a pregnant hush as the music came on with a soul-haunted beat. Lance seemed content at first to stand in one spot and pluck his guitar delicately, as though deep in meditation. But gradually he began to slink back and forth across the stage, twanging more insistently, putting a harder, funkier edge on the music. He was dressed like a futuristic highwayman, in a cocked hat and glittering blue metallic tights, with pistol bandoliers across his bare chest and his legs encased in silver boots. Sweat beaded his forehead as the music grew louder and his voice rose to a hoarse shout. At times he seemed to be threatening or sneering at the audience, while others cajoling or making love to it. When not playing his guitar or taking a quick turn at the synthesizer, he would clutch a portable mic with manic intensity and yell out fresh choruses, all the while prancing, stomping, or pirouetting about the stage, occasionally leaping and twirling high in the air. Barely 10 minutes into the concert, the audience was clapping and stamping its feet, and the crowned heads gave them no chance to relax. They segued from number to number with scarcely a pause. But it was Lance Warwick who held the audience mesmerized. He seemed to play on his fans' emotions as easily as he twanged out chords on his guitar. At times, Nancy felt certain he was playing and singing especially to her. From the corner of her eye, she stole a swift glance at her girlfriends. Both Bess and George were staring at the Rock King entranced, their eyes wide open, lips slightly parted. With a shock, Nancy realized she'd been doing the same thing herself. Snap out of it, she chided herself jokingly. The guy's a mere human. He's just putting on a show. But what a show. Dazzling costume changes, highwayman to Indian chief to starship trooper to medieval troubadour, combined with special effects left the audience gasping. Camera crews could be seen taping the show for a rock video. By the time the curtain descended, Nancy felt exhausted. So, she could see, did Bess and George. Well, how did you like it? She asked. I'll never forget tonight, Bess confided huskily, reaching over to clutch Nancy's hand. All George could do was nod in enthusiastic agreement. A buzz of chatter filled the auditorium as everyone stood or shifted position to ease their cramped muscles. Some were hurrying up the aisles to the restrooms or for refreshment refills, but most remained seated, knowing the group would soon return for their encore numbers. A uniformed usher was making his way along the front row. Nancy suddenly realized he was approaching her. "Miss Nancy Drew?" "Yes?" "This is for you." He held out a folded message. End of chapter 4. I just have to say, the descriptions of this man are something else I've never seen in a Nancy Drew book, ever. I scoff again about, oh, hang on, I gotta scroll up. "A nice day for a shattered space oddity" is the Crowned Heads hit song. Feels odd they randomly throw in Billy Idol. Like, was this written right after White Wedding Part 1 or one of his two other songs? Yeah. "In the midnight hour, she cried more, more, more." I scoff again about Nancy feeling bad digging into someone's private life. "A man of many talents." It's true. Hi, Tom. How are you? "What can we call an Australian backup group?" "Just call it Didgeridoos or something." But okay, everybody okay with Didgeridoos? Yeah. Thank you for shouting out, Tom. "How'd you like it?" Nancy claimed, "Needed more popo." Yeah, I feel like some of the descriptions are not exactly family friendly. I was feeling a little uncomfortable. So, oh boy. All right, let's move on to chapter 5. Oh boy. Chapter 5, Press Party. Even before she opened the note, Nancy guessed who it was from. The paper bore the Crowned Heads insignia, a cartoon of Lance Warwick weighed down by a huge king's crown sagging at a cockeyed angle, with the other members of the group around him wearing only slightly less imposing coronets. The message was scrawled in purple ink, royal purple, and signed in his usual joking fashion, L.R. Nancy knew this stood for Lancelot Rex. Her two friends were staring at her eagerly. "Tell us," begged Bess. "Who's it from?" "As if we can't guess," said George. "Lance is inviting us to the press party after the show." A chorus of odd exclamations made Nancy aware that her two chums weren't the only ones around her keenly interested in her message from the Rock King. Presently, the curtains rose again to loud stamping, cheering, and applause as the Crowned Heads returned for their encore. The Rock King and his group wound up their performance at peak power, knowing they had their fans completely enthralled. Nancy felt sure now that it hadn't just been her imagination. All those times when he'd paused at the edge of the stage and gazed down through the glare of the spotlights, he really had been singing to her, and now he was doing it again. She shivered with suppressed excitement. How in the world had all this come about? In little more than 24 hours, she had not only met the hottest star on the international rock scene, but the acquaintance seemed to be taking a romantic turn. "Let's not get silly now," Nancy cautioned herself. "I come from a nice little suburban community called River Heights, and I have a boyfriend back there named Ned Nickerson, who's much more my type than this British wild man Lance Warwick." But it was hard to think sensibly with that pulsating rock beat throbbing through the auditorium. After numerous curtain calls, the show was finally over. The fans began surging out through the aisles as noisily and good-naturedly as they had entered. "Where exactly is this press party?" inquired George, her mouth close to Nancy's ear. "The note said any guard could direct us." From a transverse aisle behind the orchestra seats, steps led down to a corridor. It, too, was filled with a jostling crowd, but after Nancy displayed her invitation from Lance at several checkpoints, the girls succeeded in reaching a pair of double doors, through which at last they gained admission to the press party. Inside was bedlam. The reception room seemed filled to overflowing. Several TV crews were busy interviewing celebrities and taping the party for the next morning's news show. The guests were milling about while waiters circulated with trays of refreshments, and somewhere in the room, Nancy imagined, were Lance and the rest of his group, although she couldn't glimpse any of them. The babble and din were deafening. "We should have brought earplugs," joked Bess. A television reporter thrust a microphone in Nancy's face. Hey, aren't you Nancy Drew, the detective? She smiled and nodded, slightly embarrassed. Have you solved the mystery of why the whole town's going bananas over Lance Warwick and the Crowned Heads? They're very talented musicians. Look, there's Adam Muir, exclaimed George. He was one of the 2 group members who had accompanied Lance to the garden party. A strikingly attractive young woman of 21 or 22 suddenly loomed at Nancy's shoulder. Can I help you, love? She chirped in a charming British accent. Less charming was her artificial smile. I'm Nancy Drew, and these are my 2 friends, Bess Marvin and George Fane. Is Lance or one of the group expecting you, young ladies? She asked pointedly. Her face was beautifully painted, and her taffy blonde hair was in an artfully styled bush. Her sleek figure was sheathed in a silver lame jumpsuit, and on her feet were raspberry suede boots with stiletto heels. Nancy displayed the handwritten invitation. Oh, yes, you're that one. Her dazzling smile flashed on and off. Well, Lance may be tied up for a while, but if you'd care to join the other girls... She fluttered her hand vaguely in the direction of several obvious groupies. Thanks, we'll manage. Yes, do. And enjoy yourselves. I'm Jane Royce, by the way. Do you believe that? George blurted as the high-styled Miss Royce snaked off through the crowd, hips a-swing. She was already beaming her charm at a bald-headed record company executive. Nancy grinned, a breath of London in the outposts of empire. She had just glimpsed Lance Warwick surrounded by reporters and hangers-on. Would she even have a chance to talk to him in this madhouse? Bess wormed her way to a refreshment table and returned clutching 3 glasses. 2 Cokes and 1 bitter lemon. Best I could do. She spoke with her mouth half full. After chewing and swallowing hastily, Bess added, and they have all sorts of yummy-looking tidbits. Let's nibble. You're on a diet, Cuddles, remember? George said sternly. The swirling tide of the guest throng brought them in sight of the Crowned Heads drummer Bobo Evans. Seeing the girls, he plowed a path toward them, accompanied by the synthesizer keyboardist Adam Muir. Both, like Lance, were still in makeup. Bobo's moon face was wreathed in a smile. Blimey, if it ain't the 3 little dolly birds from the garden party, he exclaimed. You remember that society bash on Long Island, don't you, Adam? But of course, my dear, how could I forget? The keyboardist's long, delicate fingers brushed Nancy lightly under the chin. Lancelot was chatting up this lovely little redhead, and thanks to her, we were privileged to meet these other 2 charmers. Bobo came from Liverpool and sounded like Ringo Starr, but Adam's accent was a South London Cockney, spoken in a high-pitched ladylike simper. Whoops. Ned would have certainly have disapproved of Adam, but Nancy couldn't help smiling at Adam's insouciant showmanship. She half suspected it was a carefully cultivated act a la Boy George. His face was powdered dead white, and his shiny black hair was slicked back in 1920s movie style. A long cigarette holder dangled from one limp-wristed hand. We thought the show was wonderful, Bess gushed. You really had the audience turned on. Yeah, well, that's what turns us on, said Bobo. All the birds out there in the concert hall listening to us and loving us. Must you go back to England so soon? That's what the king says, Ducky, but if you can talk him out of it. As Bess laughed happily, George said to Adam, Who's that creature in the silver jumpsuit? Jane Royce, you mean? Right, what's her job? Publicity, does all our advanced promotion. Acts as a producer, too, for some of our records when Lance doesn't feel like doing it personally. So that's it. George shot an acid glance across the room at the silver-suited young Englishwoman. She came on as if she was the Crowned Head's house mother and boss lady. Adam tittered in delight, one hand on his hip. Oh dear, you don't know the half of it. She's the Queen Mum herself. Oh yes, indeed. Quite the power behind the throne is our Janie. Nancy was not exactly pleased to think of Jane Royce having any control over Lance Warwick, but tried not to show it. Bess headed back to the refreshment table with Bobo, and Adam was accosted by a future reporter who drew him away to face the lens of a news photographer. Adam insisted on bringing George along on one arm to pose with him. George balked at first, fearing she might, in her own words, look silly, but Adam smoothly overrode her reluctance. Nancy was glad to be left alone to relax and collect her thoughts. The respite was brief. Feeling a hand on her arm, Nancy turned and caught her breath as she found herself face to face with Lance Warwick. Her heart gave a sudden lurch. Nancy, my sweet, what a charge I got out of seeing you down there in the front row, a vision of loveliness with those red gold locks. It was hard not to smile with pleasure at such words. He went on, and what a gorgeous surprise! Positively lifted my performance to new heights. I'd no idea you were such a rock fan, much less a fan of mine, especially after that brush-off you gave me at the garden party. Nancy's smile gave way to bewilderment. I don't understand. Didn't you expect me to use those tickets? What tickets? The ones you sent? Me? It was Lance's turn to look blankly bewildered. I never sent you any tickets. End of chapter 5. Chapter 5, when we describe in detail Lance's changing of outfits for 3 pages. I love Ned Kay! Yeah, I like how Nancy constantly keeps forgetting she indeed has a boyfriend. That lady dresses in the dark. Jane, why you not having Nancy play Skulls and Bones to get backstage? Go dig. The Bluebeard Room, aka this ghostwriter knows popular music from the 60s all the way to the 80s. And also wants to be hip with the kids. Thank you for the claps. One more chapter and I'm gonna call it. For now, until I switch over to Pokemon. The kids. They love to rock and or roll musics. Yeah, they do. Alright, let's do one more chapter. Chapter 6, Powder Bag. Seeing the startled, dismayed expression that flickered over Nancy's face, the rock star groped for a way out. Well, now look, love. The gang all knew what a terrific impression you made on me. I reckon one of them sent you the tickets. Nancy smiled politely, appreciating his tact. Yes, I expect it was something like that. Anyhow, I thought your performance tonight was out of this world. You and the group were terrific. I say, aren't you the sweet thing to shower us with such compliments? Nancy felt like falling through the floor. How could she have been so vain as to think a world-famous star like Lance Warwick would go out of his way to invite her to his sellout concert, as his personal guest yet? Most humiliating of all, she'd exposed her nitwit fantasies, and now he had obviously sized her up as one more groupie candidate. This press party's just for the vulgar mob, Nance was saying, but we've laid on a real celebration later at the hotel. Your presence is expected, need I add, by royal command. The King of Rock slipped a cozy arm around Nancy's waist. There are a couple limos standing by. The gang and I'll sneak away as soon as the streets clear a bit and this lot here gets enough of a buzz on so they won't notice. Meanwhile, why don't you and your friends stick close to the other birds so we'll know where to find you when the time comes? Nancy felt slightly sick. Already he was consigning her, Bess, and George to the status of royal groupies. Thanks, but we really can't stay much longer, she heard herself respond. We'll probably be flying out of New York tomorrow, so we'd better get our beauty sleep. Oh, come on now, Lance wheedled. What does a ravishing creature like you need with any beauty sleep? But Nancy merely smiled and shook her head as she slipped out of his one-armed embrace. He reluctantly let her go with a quick kiss on the cheek as other guests clamored for his attention. Once she was out of Lance's sight, Nancy looked around for a place to collect herself. A powder room offered the nearest refuge. As she hurried toward it, she felt her cheeks burning with shame and tears prickling her eyes. Fortunately, no one seemed to notice her unnerved state. All the other females in the powder room were too busy chattering away excitedly. Nancy found a place in front of the mirror and dashed cold water on her face. How silly to get upset, she scolded herself. I'll never see Lance again after tonight anyway. What difference does it make? She repaired her mascara deftly with a few quick strokes. She repaired her makeup deftly with a few quick strokes of mascara and dabs of eyeshadow and lip gloss. As Nancy turned from the mirror to put the cosmetics in her bag, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a silver-clad figure disappearing out the door. A faint resentment stirred at the thought that Jane Royce might have observed her distress, but Nancy had her feelings under control now and dismissed the matter with a shrug. Outside the powder room, the press party was still in full swing. A magazine writer recognized the famous young sleuth and waylaid her for an interview. While they chatted, Nancy's roving glance spotted George Fane. She was engaged in a lively discussion with several other guests on the subject, Nancy later learned, of rock music trends. George rejoined her when the interview was over. Together they went looking for Bess and found her still at the refreshment table. Bobo Evans, it seemed, had wandered off with the group's bass player, Freddie Isham, but Bess had lingered to sample some chocolate strawberries, which had just been added to the array of tidbits. Heavens, can't we leave you alone for 2 minutes? George teased. The complaint ended in a gulp of delight as Bess silenced her by popping one of the strawberries into George's mouth. "No more, you've had enough," Bess declared sharply, rapping George's knuckles as her cousin reached for a second helping. Nancy doubled up with laughter. "By the way, didn't I see you with Lance Warwick?" Bess asked her Tishan-haired chum. "You did, and he invited us to a private party at his hotel, but don't get all a Twitter, Bess dear, we're not going," Nancy added, seeing her friend's china blue eyes light up at the prospect. Bess's pretty face fell. "Why not?" "Because he already has classified us as groupie recruits. That's why." Much of the fun seemed to go out of the party at Nancy's revelation, and as midnight was fast approaching, the three girls decided to leave. Half an hour later, a taxi deposited them outside the Gothic apartment building on the west side. Hope we won't have to wake up your aunt," said George, "or will she be waiting up?" "Probably. Aunt Eloise is sort of a night owl, but it doesn't matter either way," said Nancy, rummaging in her handbag. "I have a key." Suddenly she caught her breath and her hand seemed to freeze. Then she fished out her key and hastily closed her bag. "Something wrong?" asked Bess. "Yes, but let's not talk about it now. It's nothing to lose any sleep over. I'll explain tomorrow morning." After breakfast the next day, George brought up the subject. "Are you going to tell us now what you found in your purse last night, Nan?" The teenage sleuth nodded and rose from the table. The others followed her into the sitting room. Nancy picked up her handbag, opened it, and took out a small, transparent plastic bag filled with sparkling white powder. George's and Bess's eyes widened, and Miss Drew gasped in dismay. "Oh no, is that what I think it is, Nancy?" "I'm afraid so, Aunt Eloise. But not to worry, I'll see that it's disposed of properly." "Do you mind if a policeman comes here to the apartment?" "Of course not, my dear. Do as you think best." Nancy telephoned a lieutenant in the New York Police Department whom she'd met on an earlier case. After hearing her story, he promised to send a narcotics squad detective over. Later, the phone rang. Mrs. Harwood was on the line. "Nancy, dear, you're booked on a flight to London, leaving tomorrow evening. Is that agreeable?" "Wonderful," Nancy enthused. "Where shall I pick up my ticket? At the airport?" "You could pick it up this afternoon. My travel agent's holding it for you, along with enough traveler's checks to cover all expenses. Her office is on Fifth Avenue." Mrs. Harwood gave her the exact address, then said, "What about your passport, dear?" "No problem. I brought it with me to New York. Daddy was expecting to fly to Venice on legal business and thought I might like to go along, but that's been put on hold, so I'm all set." Bess and George had overheard enough to guess that Nancy's travel arrangements to London had been finalized. Both clamored for details, and Nancy found herself wishing her two girlfriends could accompany her on the flight to England. They were equally wistful. "Gee, wouldn't it be great if we could shop at the London stores together and take in a concert at the Palladium?" said George. "Instead of which we'll be flying home to River Heights," said Bess regretfully. "Never mind, maybe we can make it a threesome next summer," Nancy said hopefully. Their chat was interrupted by the bell from the lobby. The police officer had arrived. Nancy buzzed him in, then opened the door to meet him when he stepped off the elevator. He strode toward her down the hall, a sharp-featured, steely-eyed man in plain clothes. "Sergeant Weintraub, Narcotics Squad." "I'm Nancy Drew, Sergeant. Please come in." She introduced him to her aunt and friends and invited him to sit down. "I suppose you've been told why I called," she said to him. "Only briefly. I'd like to hear it in your own words, Miss Drew." Nancy explained how she found the plastic bag full of white powder in her handbag after returning from the concert. "I assume this is cocaine, or am I jumping to conclusions?" He examined the evidence. "Nope, it's coke all right. High-grade stuff from the looks of it. Any idea how this got in your purse, Miss Drew?" "Someone put it there, obviously. But you've no idea who." Nancy hesitated for a fraction of a moment. "Not really. I suppose it could have been almost anyone we passed in the street or at the concert." Weintraub looked dubious. "People don't usually give this stuff away. Once it's cut and sold, this much alone could bring several $1,000s. Or several years in prison, I imagine," Nancy said wryly, which might be a good reason for getting rid of it in a hurry. The detective nodded. "Yeah, that figures. Maybe someone had to ditch it fast and your handbag was the nearest convenient place. At this press party for the crowned heads that you went to, did you see anyone handle your purse?" Nancy thought of the silver-clad figure she'd glimpsed leaving the powder room. "No, but that's not saying it couldn't have happened." "How well do you know the crowned heads?" The Tishan-haired teenager shrugged. "Not very. We just met them at a garden party on Long Island 2 days ago. And on the strength of that, you attended their press party last night. Lance Warwick saw us in the audience and had one of the ushers bring us an invitation." Sergeant Weintraub frowned thoughtfully. He didn't by any chance invite you to the private party later on at his hotel. As a matter of fact, he did during the press reception, but it was already close to midnight, and, well, we thought it best to come on home. Smart girl. Nancy shot the narcotics officer a cool glance. What exactly are you implying? Well, it so happens we got an anonymous phone tip saying there'd be drugs at that party. Nancy was startled as the significance of his remark flashed through her mind. You don't mean you raided the Crown Heads Hotel suite? Weintraub nodded emphatically. We sure did, with a search warrant. If you'd been there with that bag of cocaine in your purse, you'd probably be behind bars now, Miss Drew. End of chapter 6. Yeah, this is not the most family-friendly Nancy Drew book. And none of this rock star, drug, cocaine stuff is in The Curse of Blackmore Manor. Dangs. That's all they ever wanted, right? Royal floozies? Yeah. Bess stuck around to eat because Bess liked eating. Being plump as she was, eating all the time. Bess likes eating all the time. How Bess is in this book. I know it's terrible. Someone put it there, obviously. Nancy knew she was busted, for it was her who put it there. Thank you for the claps. I really enjoyed the detour. The detour, how it, like, definitely, we're 6 chapters, we're a third of the book in, and Nancy hasn't even made it to London for, like, the actual Penvillain stuff. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I feel like Nancy doing lines of coke would explain why Nancy thought she was stealing with a werewolf lady. Good morning, Krusty Crew. Good morning, Oscar. Missed opportunity. They probably had to make it a little more G-rated. So, Oscar, you actually popped in right at the end of my read stream. So, I'm going to be calling it here. I'm going to take about a 15-minute break and switch over to some Pokemon. And I will be live again in about 15-20 minutes with some Pokemon. I'm going to get a little snackety snack and switch over OBS and all of that good stuff. And then I'll be live again. But I appreciate you coming in. Thank you so much for shouting out, Oscar. She did lines of pixie sticks in the interactive version. Yeah, that's what it was. Alright, guys. I'll see you soon. Thank you for hanging out with me this morning. It felt good to do some reading again since I haven't done any since we finished a series of unfortunate events. So, hopefully we'll see you again in 15 to 20 minutes. Pure uncut sugar. Hopefully I'll see you again. Cool, gives me time to fully wake up. That works perfectly then. So see you guys in about 15-20 minutes. Take care of yourselves. If I don't see you later, I hope to see you soon. Again, thanks for hanging out. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to y'all very soon. Bye.